They said it smelled like death. Imagine that. My daughter, holding the jacket of the only man who ever chose me without hesitation. 2 fingers pinching the collar like it was something diseased, and saying, with that clipped, polished little voice she uses when she wants to sound reasonable, "Mom, this needs to go. It stinks of death." And then she tossed it into the trash bin, the way people throw away used tissues. I didn't even have time to open my mouth. My husband's jacket, his old, soft navy work jacket that still held the faintest echo of pine and engine oil and the citrus soap he favored in the last years, landed against a crumpled cereal box and a cluster of damp paper towels, and she wiped her hands afterward, as if touching his memory had dirtied her. Well, I didn't say anything then. At 82, silence becomes a second skin. You learn to wrap yourself in it the way others wrap themselves in cashmere. But the sentence cut through me as sharply as the winter wind that seeped under her immaculate doorframes. It smells like death. No, my dear girl, it smelled like life. Ours. But you wouldn't know the difference anymore. I stood there in her spotless kitchen, feeling the laminate floor solid under my aching feet, and I swear the house itself seemed offended by me. Everything was too white, too polished, too curated. Even the fruit bowl held oranges that looked bought for decoration, not eating. She had invited me for a weekend, she said, to help declutter and go through old things. But the truth was visible the moment I crossed her threshold. She wanted to redesign me, streamline me, file me down. I was too much texture, too much memory, too much unphotographed past for her sleek designer life. She walked through rooms gesturing at shelves and drawers like a realtor showing a property to a hesitant buyer, and each time she glanced back at me, her eyes flicked over my clothes, my movements, my pauses, like she was calculating what needed to be sanded off. She didn't see that I'd already shrunk myself for decades. She didn't notice how slowly I moved now, not because of age, but because I'd spent years tiptoeing around her temper. Carefully phrased advice, swallowed comments, the humiliating art of pretending not to hear the sighs she released whenever I mentioned her father. I used to think that if I were gentle enough, polite enough, quiet enough, I could hold on to her the way I held on to him, with tenderness and patience, and the belief that love was heavier than resentment. But daughters grow differently than memories. They harden in ways mothers never expect. The jacket wasn't even on her list of things to throw away. It had hung in my closet for 19 years, untouched by anyone but me. 19 years of winters and lonely birthdays and evenings when I'd bury my face in its shoulder, just to remember what warmth felt like. Not the body warmth, but the safety of someone who wanted me alive. I brought it with me because she told me to pack only essentials. And what could be more essential than the last trace of the man who stood beside me through every poverty and every dream? He'd worn it on our final autumn walk. The evening his breath grew shallow, and I pretended the pink in his cheeks was health, not the beginning of goodbye. I kept it because I wasn't ready to let go of the version of myself that existed beside him. But that morning, she moved through the house with the brisk, rehearsed certainty of a woman who believes she's saving something. She opened my suitcase without asking, plucked the jacket out like it was a dish rag, frowned, and said that sentence. I suppose, to her, grief is something you should pack neatly in a labeled box, store in a garage, or donate to charity. She has tidy categories for everything: heirlooms, documents, trash. There is no category for a mother's heart. I watched her walk past me toward the back door, the jacket dangling like a dead thing in her manicured hand. I followed her step for step, though she didn't notice. She was already deciding where the jacket belonged in her taxonomy of the acceptable. When she lifted the trash bin lid, I felt the air leave my lungs like I'd been punched. Not because of the gesture itself. I've lost people, not objects. I know what real loss is, but because she did it without ceremony, without hesitation, without a second of wondering why I might still need it. That's when I realized something sharp and honest. She had stopped seeing me years ago. She saw only the burden, the inconvenience, the fragile old woman who needed guidance. She didn't see the woman who once held her through nights of fever, who sold her wedding ring to pay for her daughter's college application fees, who scrubbed floors and packed lunches and learned to cook vegetarian food for the boyfriend who disappeared 2 months later. No, to her I was just another old thing taking up space. When the lid snapped shut, she turned with a bright, satisfied smile, the kind women wear when they believe they've solved a problem. "There," she said, dusting her palms. "One less thing to worry about." She didn't see my hands curl slightly. She didn't hear the memory inside me shift, like a tree cracking under winter ice. I nodded, because nodding is easier than bleeding onto white tile. She breezed back inside, humming, her heels clicking lightly as if the house itself applauded her. When she was gone, I stepped outside again. The wind had picked up, tossing leaves across the yard. I lifted the trash bin lid carefully, almost apologetically, the way one might open a casket alone at dawn. The jacket lay near the top, looking smaller than I remembered, a meek folded shadow of the man it once carried. I reached for it with both hands, and something in the lining crunched beneath my fingers. A sound I hadn't heard before. For a moment I thought it might be an old receipt, maybe one of his grocery lists he scribbled on envelopes. But no. When I pressed again, I felt the unmistakable edge of stiff paper. My heart did something strange then. Slow, heavy, deliberate, like it had been waiting 19 years for this exact moment. I pulled the jacket closer, slid my hand into the inner pocket, and felt the corner of an envelope sealed tight, thick, official. My husband's handwriting curved across the front. I hadn't seen that handwriting in 19 years. And there, just beneath the flap, beneath the faint scent of pine he always carried home after working in the yard, lay the first tremor of something I couldn't name yet. I held the jacket to my chest, the cold fabric pressing against my ribs, and for a long time I stood in the gray light of her perfect yard, breathing him in, breathing me in, realizing that whatever was inside that envelope had waited for me. Not for her, not for anyone else, me. And that realization held a kind of power I hadn't felt since the day he died. When I finally walked back inside with the jacket draped over my arm, my daughter didn't look up. She didn't notice anything at all. But I did. I noticed everything. When I finally tore the envelope open that evening, sitting on the edge of the guest bed with the jacket spread across my lap like a fragile relic, I half expected to find only a letter. Maybe something sentimental my husband had written in one of his softer moods, one of those late-night confessions he used to slip into my pocket when he thought I was sleeping. Instead, what slid into my trembling palm was a folded legal document, heavy with the kind of authority that doesn't wilt under tears, the kind of paper that doesn't lie. The dim bedside lamp cast a yellow circle across the page, enough for me to see the bolded heading, Property Title Transfer. I blinked once, twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something gentler. But the details were unmistakable. My husband had purchased a small house in our name, no, in my name, only months before he died, and he had never told me. Nestled behind the deed was a letter in his handwriting, not long, not poetic, but steady, careful, the way he always wrote when he wanted me to pay attention. He explained that he had bought the house as a safety net, a place where I could go if life ever twisted itself into something small and suffocating. He didn't mention our daughter by name, but he didn't have to. The subtext lay between the strokes of his pen. He knew even then that she would grow into a woman who measured affection in convenience and respect in terms of control. He knew her charm had sharp edges. He knew she loved him more softly than she loved me. He knew that after his death I would be alone, not because he had gone, but because she would choose distance over caretaking. He knew, and he prepared. As I finished reading, something fierce and unfamiliar stirred in me. Not anger, not quite sadness, something deeper, older, a slow rising awareness that every doubt I'd swallowed over the years had been valid. I folded the documents as gently as if they were newborn skin, slipped them back into the envelope, and held it against my chest. The house was real. My name was there in ink that still held the faintest smell of printer toner. It existed somewhere, waiting, and I knew instantly my daughter must never control it. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen carrying the jacket. My daughter glanced at it only briefly, then went back to loading the dishwasher, humming a tuneless melody that irritated me more than I cared to admit. The sun wasn't fully up, and the house felt too bright for so early an hour, its sterile surfaces gleaming with a cold cheerfulness that seemed almost mocking. I sat at the counter, waiting for her to finish banging dishes into place. She finally looked at me, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in that brisk managerial way she had. "You really kept that thing?" she asked, nodding toward the jacket with a faint grimace, as though even acknowledging its existence left a distaste on her tongue. I told her I had found something important inside it, something private, something from her father. Her eyes flicked toward the envelope with unmistakable interest. Not sentimental interest, but chemical, calculating. The way a banker looks at a portfolio he didn't know existed. She extended her hand, palm up, fingers expectant. "Let me see," she said, and her voice had shifted, turned smooth, almost gentle. The kind of gentle that isn't kindness but strategy. I told her no, calmly, simply, but firmly enough that it drew her eyebrows together in a small, offended frown. She stood straighter, taller, as if height could lend legitimacy to entitlement. Then she began the soft-voiced interrogation. What was in it? Why was I being secretive? Why was I acting strange? Didn't I trust her? Why would her father hide something from her? She asked each question like a velvet-wrapped dagger. I told her it was a private matter between me and my husband, one she had no right to. That was when the mask cracked. Her voice snapped, a brittle sound like glass tightening under heat. "You're not thinking clearly," she said. "You don't know what you're holding. I need to look at those papers to make sure everything is handled appropriately." Handled appropriately. A phrase that had followed me through years of condescension. I stood up, slower than I wanted, because my hips punished sudden movements, and told her I was taking a walk, that I needed air, that adulthood didn't give her ownership of my life. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, and she followed me to the door with steps that were too quick, too anxious. "Please don't make this difficult," she said, reaching for the envelope. But I kept it close to my chest, tucked beneath the fabric of the jacket, and stepped outside before she could finish. The air was cold enough to sting, and the sky hung heavy with unfallen rain. I walked past the carefully manicured bushes she'd hired a gardener to trim every 2 weeks, past her neighbor's polished SUV and the mailbox shaped like a tiny birdhouse that looked too whimsical for reality. The street was empty, except for a man walking a dog that looked bored with its own existence. The silence gave me space to think, and thinking brought clarity. The deed wasn't just a document. It was a warning my husband had left, with love disguised as practicality. He'd always been like that. Never one for speeches, but always preparing tools for the storms he knew I'd face. When I returned, she was waiting for me in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch like a prosecutor preparing for closing arguments. Her hands were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale, jaw clenched. She didn't ask whether I was cold. She didn't ask how I was. She asked again to see the envelope. When I refused a second time, her temper didn't flare outward. It imploded inward, as her temper always did, forming that brittle, icy calm that had frozen me out of her life more often than I cared to recall. She said I was being unreasonable, that I was withholding important financial information, that I didn't understand how things worked, that she was just trying to help. But there was fear in her, too, thin, metallic fear, because she realized that whatever was in that envelope gave me power she thought I'd lost years ago. She stood up and stepped toward me, and for the first time in my life, I thought she might actually reach for something in my hands. That tiny movement, that mere suggestion of force, was the true break in the world as I knew it. My own daughter, the child whose scraped knees I'd kissed, whose nightmares I'd soothed, whose every dream I'd sacrificed for. My daughter looked ready to take from me. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. Not cruelty, not vengeance, just resolve. I told her she needed to step back. She did, but not willingly. Her expression twisted in disbelief, as though the world itself had tilted out of alignment, as though she could not fathom a version of reality in which her mother told her no and meant it. She whispered something like, "Mom, please." But the softness wasn't love. It was desperation wrapped in control. I turned away and walked to the guest room, closed the door with a slowness that made it clear I didn't slam doors anymore. I ended chapters. And behind that closed door, holding the jacket and the deed and the letter that had waited 19 years for me, I knew the truth with perfect clarity. The moment she threw away the jacket, she threw away the illusion that we were still mother and daughter in any way that mattered. My husband had given me a house. She had given me a reason to use it. And that was the true beginning of everything that came next. When I woke the next morning, the house already felt different, as if sometime during the night it had shifted its weight, settling into a position that made my presence feel even more temporary, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome by the simple crime of breathing. My daughter moved through the kitchen with a too-bright efficiency, opening cabinets with quick, controlled gestures and closing drawers with a care that only highlighted how hard she was working to appear calm. She offered me coffee in a tone so sweet it tasted bitter, and I realized that she had decided, in the quiet hours between midnight and sunrise, that my refusal to hand over the envelope was not simply stubbornness, but a problem to be solved, a kink in her perfect system that needed to be ironed out before the weekend ended. She asked about my sleep, about my walk the day before, about whether I felt steady, a word she laced with casual condescension. a word she used only when she was trying to convince herself that I was slipping, losing grip, becoming what she feared most, an elderly mother who might one day need her. I answered each question with the lightness of someone who has nothing left to prove, and that lightness unsettled her because she preferred me hesitant, apologetic, easy to shepherd. As the morning unfolded, she managed to maintain her fragile facade, but every so often, when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes darted toward the jacket draped over the back of the chair, as though it were an animal waiting to bite or a safe she wanted to crack open. The envelope remained where I had tucked it, inside the lining of the jacket, pressed close to my side whenever I moved, and I could sense her agitation growing with every minute she couldn't get her hands on it. She suggested, almost casually, that she could help me go through my papers later, to organize them, to make things easier for me. A phrase that landed with the soft menace of someone laying the foundation for future control. When I told her I already had a system, she smiled, but her smile was a thin, worried thing, stretched too tight across nerves she pretended she didn't have. Later that day, she hovered near me with questions she framed as concern, but which felt like small probes designed to test the edges of my independence. Did I still pay my bills on time? Did I remember which medications were taken at night and which in the morning? Had I been feeling foggy lately? Had I considered consolidating my accounts so she could monitor them in case something happened? She spoke as if she were offering me the world, but what she wanted was the map, the compass, and the deed to the land. Her words were coated in the syrupy tone of caretaking, yet beneath it pulsed something harder, something hungry, something that had begun forming years ago, long before I had noticed the shift. I think the real escalation began in the afternoon, when she announced that we should start sorting through my belongings, even though I had brought only a single suitcase and a small tote bag with me. She said it lightly, chirping the words as though we were embarking on a pleasant weekend project. But her eyes kept sliding toward the chair where the jacket rested, and I understood that she hoped to disarm me through distraction. She began opening my suitcase without waiting for my agreement, lifting each folded item of clothing with delicate, pinched fingers, inspecting them as though she were a customs officer searching for contraband. She commented on the age of my sweaters, the wear on my nightgown, the frayed edges of the scarf I'd knitted decades ago, as if the erosion of fabric were evidence of the erosion she imagined in my mind. Then, casually, she asked again about the envelope. She asked where I planned to store it, what my intentions were, whether I fully grasped the implications of the documents inside. When I told her that my plans were not yet decided, she inhaled sharply, a tiny intake of breath that revealed all the panic she tried so desperately to hide. She followed me through the house after that, not obviously, but with a kind of calculated proximity, always in the next room, always listening for the rustle of paper or the creak of a drawer. When I went to the bathroom, she passed by the door twice, calling my name with excessive cheerfulness. When I sat down in the living room, she took the armchair nearest me and began asking about my finances with a steady stream of harmless questions that were anything but harmless. She asked whether I kept cash at home, whether I had a will updated in the last 5 years, whether I might need someone to take over the management of my assets. I answered nothing directly, and that irritated her. She wanted clarity, but clarity in her language meant vulnerability in mine, and I had no intention of giving her either. Around 4 in the afternoon, while she prepared tea with exaggerated domestic warmth, I stepped outside again, needing air that hadn't been filtered through obligation. The yard was too perfect, the lawn manicured with a precision that left no room for wildness, no space for anything to grow freely. I paced slowly around the perimeter, tracing the line of the fence with my fingertips, thinking of the house hidden in the deed, the place my husband had bought without telling me, a place far from here, where no one would monitor my steps or evaluate the steadiness of my mind. As I walked, I realized that my daughter's sudden intensity wasn't just about the house. It was about the fear that I might still possess some sliver of autonomy, some piece of life she hadn't anticipated, some resource she couldn't fold into the neat architecture of her world. She needed me small. She needed me grateful. She needed me predictable. And the deed, my deed, threatened all of that. When I returned inside, the atmosphere had cooled, not in temperature but in tone. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, watching me with an expression that was no longer masked by politeness. In that moment, she looked like someone assessing damages after a storm, calculating what needed repair and what needed removal. She asked again where the envelope was, and when I told her it was safe, she took a step forward. Just one, subtle but unmistakable, as though proximity might pressure me into surrender. Something in her face betrayed a flicker of anger, thin, metallic, almost imperceptible, but there. She told me I was making things difficult, that she was trying to help, that she couldn't do that if I insisted on behaving irrationally. I wanted to tell her that rationality is often defined by those who benefit most from controlling the narrative, but I held my tongue. Instead, I simply told her that I was going to rest, that I didn't need tea, and that I preferred to be alone for a while. I closed myself in the guest room again, the jacket lying beside me, the envelope tucked securely beneath the lining, and for a long time, I sat on the bed listening to the noises of the house. Her footsteps moving with agitated precision down the hallway, the opening and closing of drawers, the soft thud of something placed too firmly on a counter. The escalation wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was a quiet, creeping storm, the kind that seeps under doors and fills the cracks between floorboards. She was preparing something. I could sense it. And that knowledge settled over me like a thin sheet of frost. But beneath the frost, something else had begun to grow too. Resolve. Not the sudden, cinematic kind, but the slow, steady kind that forms in the bones of a woman who realizes she has been underestimated for too long. And as I sat there in the dim guest room, with the last gift of my husband resting against my side, I understood that the next step, whatever it would be, had already begun to take shape in me, even if I could not yet name it. I didn't sleep that night, though I kept my eyes closed long enough for my daughter to believe I had drifted off, because that was easier than enduring her hovering presence, easier than listening to the soft, controlled sighs she released each time. She passed by my door to check, or to listen, or perhaps to confirm that I wasn't rifling through my own belongings without her permission. The house settled into the deep, artificial quiet of modern homes, the kind built too tightly to let the wind speak through the walls, and I lay there in a room that felt less like a guest space and more like a holding cell, meant to keep everything about me neatly contained. The jacket was beside me, its familiar weight like a warm hand against my side, and inside it, the envelope felt almost alive, as if the truth my husband left had been breathing all these years, waiting for the exact moment when I would need its pulse. To guide me, I ran my fingers lightly over the fabric and tried to imagine him, tried to conjure the sound of his voice, the subtle rumble in his chest when he laughed, the quiet ways he communicated without words. And with each memory that surfaced, I felt Something inside me began to shift, not violently, not with the shock of epiphany, but with the slow, steady clarity of a sunrise that refuses to be rushed. By the time the first hint of morning crept through the half-closed blinds, I had already made up my mind to leave the house for a while, not in fear, but in necessity. I needed to be under a sky he might have seen, needed to walk without someone analyzing the angle of my steps or the speed of my breathing, needed to think with the dignity of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between help and control. So I slipped out before my daughter fully woke, though I heard her stirring upstairs, the faint groan of a floorboard protesting beneath her haste. I left quietly, but not sneakily. I closed the door with a deliberate care that would tell her nothing except that I was still capable of using my own hands. Thank you very much. The morning air was cool and sharp, the kind that reminds you you're still alive, that your lungs still have work to do, that your bones still hold a little defiance, even after years of being pressed into smaller and smaller shapes. I walked without a destination, following the gentle curve of the neighborhood street as it wound past houses that looked nearly identical, each one striving for the same curated perfection my daughter seemed to worship. But there was a small bench at the end of the street, tucked beside a row of overgrown hedges that someone had neglected to trim. Thank God for small rebellions. And I sat there, with the jacket laid carefully beside me and the envelope held between my hands. I unfolded the letter again, letting my eyes trace the familiar slope of his handwriting, each stroke steady and confident. The handwriting of a man who rarely doubted anything except whether he had done enough for the people he loved. He wrote about the house with a simplicity that broke me open. He wrote that he had chosen it because it was quiet, because it was near water, because he believed I would need a place one day where I could hear myself think without interruption. He didn't say why he thought that, but I knew. He had seen the tension between my daughter and me long before either of us had the courage or cruelty to name it. He had watched her grow into a woman whose ambitions hardened her edges, who adopted refinement as a fortress, who preferred the admiration of others to the intimacy of family. And he had watched me shrink myself, smoothing the roughness of her moods with forgiveness, softening the blows of her unkindness with patience, carrying the weight of her disappointments as if they were my personal failures. He had known the imbalance. He had known it would worsen without him. And so he had left me a place where I might one day remember who I was before I became the lubricant that kept my daughter's world turning smoothly. Sitting on that bench, with the letter trembling in my hands, I felt the shift inside me become something undeniable. It was not anger that rose first. Anger is too bright, too sharp. It flares and fades. It was recognition, the heavy, grounded kind that settles deep in the chest and demands to be acknowledged. I realized that the version of myself I had been living as, the compliant mother, the aging woman grateful for any crumb of attention, the quiet guest in her own life, was not the whole truth of me. I realized that somewhere beneath the fatigue and the fear of being a burden, a spine still existed. Somewhere beneath the years of swallowing my voice to keep the peace, a tongue still remembered its strength. And I realized that the house he left me was not merely a contingency plan, but a gesture of faith in the part of me I had forgotten. By the time I returned to my daughter's house, she was waiting for me. Arms folded, lips pressed into a thin expression she tried to disguise as concern. She demanded to know where I had been, why I had left, why I kept disappearing without telling her, as if a woman in her 80s could vanish like a fox in the forest. I told her I had gone for a walk, that I needed air. that I was thinking. The last word, thinking, seemed to unsettle her the most, as though independent thought were a sign of declining health. She launched into another rehearsed speech about safety and vulnerability, about how unpredictable the world was, about how she only wanted what was best for me. But the words slid off me like water from glass. I felt strangely calm, grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years, and that calm made her nervous. She kept searching my face for signs of confusion, for the cracks she hoped would justify her intervention, but I offered her none. I watched her grow smaller in the space between us as she realized I was not as pliable as she remembered. I went upstairs without waiting for permission, a small act of rebellion that felt immense in its quietness. In the guest room, I took out my phone and searched for the address on the deed. A small house by the coast, no more than a few hours away, modest but sturdy, built in the 70s with a porch that faced the water. Seeing the image of it on the screen, faded paint, crooked shutters, wild grass growing around the foundation, filled me with an emotion I had not felt since my husband died. Possibility. I could imagine myself there, waking to the sound of gulls instead of polite criticism, sitting by the window with a blanket over my knees, reading his letter again and again until the loneliness softened into something survivable. I could imagine cooking something real, something warm, something that didn't come from a spreadsheet of calories and macros. I could imagine silence that belonged to me, not silence forced upon me by someone else's discomfort. That vision didn't frighten me. It steadied me. It became a direction, a path that had always been there, but which I had never noticed because I had been facing the wrong way. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt the truth rise in me, not as a whisper, but as a clear, resonant certainty. I could leave. I could go to the house he left me. I didn't need permission. I didn't need approval. I didn't need to justify my choices to a woman who saw me as an inconvenient afterthought in the architecture of her curated life. I was old, yes, but not finished. I was grieving, yes, but not defeated. And above all, I was still capable of choosing myself. When I left the room and walked down the stairs, I carried myself differently. Not taller, not faster, but with a steadiness she hadn't seen in years. She noticed immediately. Her eyes followed me with a mixture of suspicion and alarm, as though she sensed the ground shifting beneath her feet. She asked again about the envelope, but this time I didn't bother with evasions. I told her simply that I would handle it. No explanation, no apology, just the truth in its simplest form. She didn't like it. She didn't understand it. And she couldn't stop it. Something in me had already turned toward the sea. I had thought the shift inside me would go unnoticed, that I could carry the new clarity quietly, like a hidden flame cupped in my palms, warming only my own bones. But my daughter sensed it almost immediately, the way animals sense an approaching storm long before the sky darkens. She watched me more carefully now, not with affection or even concern, but with a sharpness that betrayed her rising panic, as if she suspected that the careful structure of control she had built around me was beginning to loosen at its joints. She became gentler in tone, but harsher in presence, hovering near me with the weight of someone who is afraid something precious might slip from her fingers. Except what she feared losing wasn't me, but whatever power she thought she had over me. The morning after, I looked up the address of the house. She appeared at my door with breakfast. Fruit arranged in perfect geometric slices on a plate that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Toast cut into clean halves and tea steeped just long enough to show she had read an article on proper steeping times. She placed the tray beside me with the precise movement of a nurse delivering medication to a patient whose cooperation could not be relied upon, and she asked how I had slept with an earnestness that almost sounded like love. Except her eyes betrayed her, constantly darting toward the jacket draped across the chair. I told her I had slept fine, and she nodded with exaggerated relief, as if my sleep were part of her responsibilities. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap, in a gesture she probably practiced in therapy, a posture meant to convey openness, and began to speak in a slow, soothing cadence that felt rehearsed, about how we should talk, about how she wanted to understand me better, about how she was only trying to help. Her words flowed like honey, but I had learned long ago that honey can hide the taste of medicine, and medicine can hide the taste of poison. She circled around the topic she really wanted, weaving through detours about my health and memory, until finally she landed where she had always intended, with the envelope, the deed, the house I didn't realize she had already decided belonged to her. She spoke of financial stability, of long-term planning, of how the family needed transparency, a word that sounded noble, but which in her mouth tasted like extraction, like she wanted to pry me open and catalog every private thought. I listened politely, the way I had listened to her as a child when she tried to explain why she had lied about breaking a vase, or why she deserved praise for something she hadn't done. She had always been skilled at talking around truths. It was a language she had mastered early. When she finally asked, no, insisted, that I show her the papers so she could properly advise me, I told her again that I would handle it myself. For a moment, her face softened into an expression of careful patience, but beneath it was a flicker of something darker, something that reminded me of the look she used to get during board games, when she realized she was losing and would rather flip the board than accept defeat. She tried again, adding that she was only thinking of my well-being, and I told her gently that my well-being wasn't something she could manage like a spreadsheet. That landed poorly. Her shoulders stiffened, her chin lifted, and the color in her face changed in a way that told me she was fighting the urge to raise her voice. The escalation began quietly, as subtle as the settling of a house before a quake. She left the room with a tight smile, and for the rest of the morning she developed a pattern of moving in and out of spaces I occupied, always finding a reason to enter the kitchen when I was there, always needing something from the living room when I sat in it, always asking me seemingly innocent questions that felt more like probes, measuring the boundaries of my patience and the contours of my resolve. Every time I moved, she moved too, like a shadow that had forgotten its place. She asked whether I needed help sorting the clothes she had rearranged in my suitcase without permission. She suggested I might want her to manage my medications, though I had taken the same 3 pills every morning for years without error. She commented on how forgetful she had become lately, implying that aging can sneak up unexpectedly, implanting the seeds of doubt she hoped would sprout into dependence. After lunch, she called a friend of hers, someone in financial services, someone who knew about elder planning, someone she believed could convince me of the necessity of merging assets, or at the very least, reviewing them together. She spoke loudly enough for me to hear fragments of the conversation. Terms like proactive measures, power of attorney, and liability avoidance floated through the air like tiny poisonous spores. When she finished the call, she didn't tell me about it. She simply walked past me with the resolute posture of someone who had made a decision and was confident in its execution. By late afternoon, she seemed unable to tolerate the uncertainty any longer. She approached me with a kind of stiff determination and told me she had scheduled an appointment for us with an attorney the following week, someone who specialized in estate transitions. I told her calmly that I wouldn't be attending any such appointment, and she looked at me as though I had announced that gravity no longer applied to me. She tried to pivot, tried to make it into a misunderstanding, but when I repeated myself, her composure fractured. Her voice rose, just slightly, but enough to reveal her true fear, that I might slip out of her grasp and into a life she couldn't control. She accused me of being manipulated by fantasies, of not understanding the responsibilities of property ownership, of endangering my future by being stubborn. I listened, the way a cliff listens to waves crashing against its base, acknowledging the noise, unchanged by it. When she realized that direct confrontation wouldn't work, she softened again, her expression turning soft and almost tearful, her hands trembling slightly as she took mine in hers and whispered that she was only trying to protect me. For a moment, for the briefest flicker of a second, I saw the little girl she once was. The child who clung to me during thunderstorms, who feared being left behind. But the child had grown into a woman who feared losing control far more deeply than she loved being close. I squeezed her hand gently and told her the truth, that I was safe, that I was capable, and that she needed to trust me. She pulled her hand back as if my words had burned her. The real escalation began in the evening, when she returned from the grocery store with a level of enthusiasm too bright to be genuine. She had bought ingredients for dinner, though she rarely cooked. She insisted we would have a proper family meal, despite the fact that the only family present was the one she refused to acknowledge fully. She moved around the kitchen with a forced grace, chopping vegetables with unnecessary force, slamming drawers in ways she thought were subtle. She tried to draw me into conversation about my health, my future, my supposed needs, and every question she asked felt like a net she was casting, hoping to catch me in a moment of uncertainty or fatigue. At one point, as she reached for a pan in the cabinet, I noticed her glance again at the jacket, which I had placed beside my chair. The glance wasn't casual. It was calculating, the look of someone assessing the distance between herself and the thing she wanted. When she leaned a little too close to it, pretending to reach for a dropped napkin, I knew she was testing whether I would react. I did not move. I simply watched her until she realized I was watching, and then she straightened quickly, her cheeks flushing with irritation. Later, after dinner, when the house sank into its evening quiet and she retreated to her office under the guise of answering emails, I heard drawers opening and closing upstairs. The unmistakable sound of someone searching for something they believe they have a right to. She searched for 30 minutes. I counted. When she came downstairs again, her expression was composed, but her breathing was too fast, betraying her frustration. She asked if I had moved anything in her office, and when I said no, she nodded stiffly, as though she didn't believe me but had decided not to confront me directly. Just before bedtime, she approached me with a new tactic, one that chilled me more deeply than all the others. She began to express concern about my memory, mentioning small things she claimed I had forgotten, things that either hadn't happened or had occurred differently than she described. She said I had repeated myself at breakfast, though I hadn't. She said I had misplaced my glasses, though she had moved them earlier that morning. She said I seemed confused when she mentioned upcoming plans, though in truth it was she who had changed the details 3 times. Each comment was delivered softly, wrapped in faux sympathy, but the intent was unmistakable. She was laying the groundwork for the idea that I might not be competent. That was when I understood that the escalation wasn't a storm passing through. It was a tide rising steadily, a tide that would erode everything if I didn't step out of its reach. I realized she would not stop. Not because she was evil, but because she could not imagine a version of love that wasn't ownership. She believed that taking control was an act of care, that management was affection, that supervision was devotion. In her mind, my independence was a threat to her identity, because she saw herself as the guardian of everything delicate, everything breakable. She saw me as fragile, but the fragility she feared was not in my mind. It was in her grip. By the time I lay in bed, the jacket once again beside me, I knew without uncertainty that I could not stay. The house held no safety for me. My daughter held no space for me. And the letter, the deed, the quiet faith my husband had placed in me, they were not simply gifts. They were instructions. And I was finally ready to follow them. I woke before dawn, not because age has thinned my sleep, but because something inside me had settled into certainty during the long, pressing hours of the night. The house was silent in that artificial way modern houses are, insulated to the point where even one's own breathing feels intrusive. I sat up slowly, letting my joints complain in their usual morning language, and reached for the jacket draped over the chair. The fabric felt familiar and steady beneath my fingers, as if it understood that today was not just another day of enduring or deflecting, but the day I would carve a small path back to myself. I held the envelope inside the lining for a moment, letting its corners press into my palm, letting its weight remind me that the life I thought had narrowed into a hallway barely wide enough for breath had, in truth, one open door waiting. My daughter was already awake, though she pretended she wasn't. I could hear the soft, rustling movements of someone rearranging objects, not to use them, but to listen, to track my steps the way a guard tracks the pacing of a prisoner. I opened the bedroom door and walked down the hallway without hesitation, making enough sound to deny her the satisfaction of believing she had caught me creeping. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen moments later, hair neatly pulled back, robe tied with unnecessary precision, offering me a smile that was too bright for the hour and too brittle for sincerity. She asked if I wanted tea, asked if I had slept well, asked if I was feeling steady. Each question delivered with that fluid, anxious eagerness of someone trying to patch cracks in a wall that has already begun to crumble. I thanked her, but told her I had an errand to run. The change in her face was instantaneous, a brief tightening around the mouth, a flash of alarm in the eyes, quickly buried under a veneer of calm. She asked what errand could possibly require attention at such an hour, and I replied that it was private. That single word, private, made her flinch as though struck, because privacy was the one realm she had spent years trying to annex. She took a step toward me, soft but controlled, and suggested that she accompany me, insisting it would be safer if we went together. I told her no, not with cruelty, not with defiance, just with clarity. And clarity was something she could not manipulate. She demanded to know what was in the envelope then, her voice finally shedding its artificial sweetness, revealing the sharp edge beneath. She said she had a right to know, that she needed to ensure I wasn't being taken advantage of, that my decisions could affect her future as well, as though my existence were merely a subplot in the grand narrative of her life. I simply told her that the envelope did not concern her, and in that moment, the last boundary she had been desperately clawing at finally closed to her, and she knew it. I put on my jacket, feeling the weight of the document against my ribs, and reached for my purse. She stood between me and the door then, not aggressively, but with that rigid stillness of someone who believes their physical presence alone is a form of authority. She told me I wasn't thinking straight, that I was making rash choices, that I was behaving irrationally, and that she couldn't let me walk out alone. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the daughter I raised, but the woman she had become. Frightened, proud, desperate to regain control of something that was slipping away from her faster than she could mask. I told her gently to move. She didn't. So I reached out, placed a hand on her arm, and guided her aside with a steadiness that surprised us both. She stepped back, stunned, as though my touch carried a strength she had forgotten I possessed. The air outside was cold enough to sting, but it welcomed me in a way the house had not in years. I walked down the driveway, feeling her eyes burning into my back from the window, but I didn't look back. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the block, the same bench where I had read my husband's letter, and waited with a calm that felt almost ceremonial. When the bus arrived, I stepped aboard and let the city roll past me in a blur of early morning light, breathing in the faint scent of diesel and damp air, letting myself exist without commentary, without diagnosis, without scrutiny. When I reached the small law office, one my husband had mentioned in the letter, I felt no trembling, no hesitation, only a quiet sense of purpose. The attorney was older, soft-spoken, with a way of listening that made me think my husband had chosen him not for his credentials, but for his humanity. I handed him the deed and the letter without theatricality. He unfolded the papers carefully, reading their contents with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who respects the weight of history contained within ink. When he looked up, his expression was warm and firm. He confirmed everything. The house was mine alone, secured without debt, protected by legal clarity that my daughter could not circumvent. He told me I had the full right to move into it, to sell it, to gift it, to hold it untouched for the rest of my days. He asked me what I wanted to do with it. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I answered without deferring to anyone's expectations. I told him I wanted to go there. I wanted to start over, simply, quietly, without ceremony, without an audience. He nodded, and there was no judgment, no surprise, only understanding. He helped me notarize a few documents that ensured no one could contest my decisions, and when I signed my name, I felt as though I were writing it for the first time, reclaiming its shape on the page. He made copies, handed me the originals, and wished me peace in a voice that made me believe he meant it. When I stepped outside, the sun had risen fully, spilling a clean, honest light across the street. I walked to the nearest taxi stand with the jacket pulled close around me, the envelope secure, and the knowledge that the next hours would define the rest of my life. The taxi driver helped me with my small bag, my only bag, and asked where I was headed. I gave him the address of the house. He nodded and began to drive. As the suburbs dissolved into open stretches of land, I felt something loosen in my chest. Something that had been wound tight for so long, I had mistaken it for part of my anatomy. The world widened around me. The wind shifted, and when the coastline finally appeared in the distance, pale blue and shimmering, I felt tears gather not from grief or fear, but from the overwhelming, humbling realization that I was free. I watched the horizon approach with the quiet astonishment of someone who has spent years in a dim corridor and now stands before a field of wildflowers. My daughter was miles behind me, still pacing her perfect kitchen perhaps, still rehearsing explanations, still searching for the narrative that would justify losing her grip. But none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the road ahead, the murmuring sea, the house waiting like a secret finally spoken aloud, and the truth that I had saved the last, most important part of my life for myself. The taxi turned onto a narrow road that seemed more suggestion than street. its edges softened by wild grass and stubborn weeds that had never learned the discipline of city landscaping. And as we climbed a gentle slope, I caught my first clear glimpse of the house my husband had chosen for me long before I knew I would need it. It was smaller than I had pictured, a little crooked around the roofline, the paint fading from white to the soft gray of old seashells, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle like a tired back that had carried too many summers. And for a moment, I simply stood on the roadside clutching my bag, listening to the sound of the ocean breathing somewhere beyond the dunes, and thinking, absurdly, that it looked as if it had been waiting for me to arrive late, but forgiven me anyway. The driver, a kind man with weathered hands, carried my suitcase to the steps and gave me the sort of smile people reserve for those they assume are visiting, not staying. I thanked him, paid him, and watched the car disappear down the road until the only sound left was the wind combing through the grass and the distant steady shush of waves turning over themselves. I found the key exactly where my husband had said it would be in his letter, tucked under a loose plank beneath the third porch step. And when the lock turned with a rusty, protesting click, I felt the strangest mix of trespass and homecoming, as if I were walking into a memory I had not personally lived, but which nonetheless belonged to me. Inside, the house smelled of dust and salt and old wood, not unpleasant, just neglected, like a book left open too long whose story was still waiting to be read. There was a small living room with a sagging sofa covered in a sheet, a narrow kitchen with chipped tile, and a sink that had forgotten the shine of regular hands, a bedroom barely larger than the bed it held, and a window that faced the sea with a stubbornness I recognized instantly. The floor creaked under my weight in a way that made no attempt to hide its age. Nothing here was trying to impress anyone. I walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces, opening cupboards, letting my fingers learn the language of this place. In a drawer beside the bed, I found a small envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, shorter than the first letter, just a few lines scrawled more shakily than he used to write, the ink wandering a little like a man who knows he is near the end of his road. He wrote that he hoped I would come when I was ready, that he did not want this house to be a symbol of escape, but of arrival, that he trusted I would know when it was time to stop asking for permission to exist. I slept that first night with the window cracked open and the jacket folded on a chair, listening to the sea speak in long, patient sentences. There were no footsteps outside my door, no soft interrogations, no questions about how I had slept or whether I felt steady. Just the simple, relentless presence of water moving toward shore and then away again, indifferent to my history, to my mistakes, to my motherhood. In the morning, light filtered through the thin curtains with none of the aggressive brightness I had grown used to in my daughter's house. Here, the day arrived like an old friend, unhurried, not demanding anything. I made coffee in a dented metal kettle that looked older than my marriage and drank it at the small table by the window, watching a line of gulls argue over something invisible on the sand. And for the first time in years, I did not feel the urge to hurry, to explain myself, to anticipate someone else's needs before acknowledging my own. The quiet was not empty. It had weight, texture, a kind of solemn kindness. It took time, of course, more than I like to admit, for my body to believe what my mind had already accepted, that no one would walk in and tell me what to do here, that no one could throw away what I chose to keep, that no one had the authority to redefine my memories as clutter. I swept the floors, opened the windows wide to let the sea air move through the rooms, wiped dust from every surface until my shoulders ached, not because I needed the house to be spotless, but because I needed it to know it was lived in again. I found an old radio in a cabinet and managed to coax it into life, the sound crackling, imperfect, full of distant stations and half-caught songs. And in the evenings, I let it murmur in the background while I made simple meals that tasted of actual hunger instead of obligation. A woman from the nearest house, a low square place with blue shutters and a wildly overgrown garden, came by one afternoon with a basket of lemons and the blunt curiosity of someone who has seen enough people come and go not to waste time on pretending indifference. She asked if I was renting or staying, and when I answered, staying, she nodded once and said, "Good," in a tone that made it sound like a blessing rather than an assessment. My daughter called, of course. The phone, which I had turned off during the drive and left buried in my bag, began to hum itself hoarse when I finally powered it on. A flood of missed calls and messages spilling across the screen like a delayed storm. There were frantic voicemails, sharp ones, tearful ones, measured ones, her voice trying on every register in search of the one that would pull me back into orbit. She accused, she pleaded, she explained, she performed concern with the skill of someone who had always been rewarded for the appearance of care rather than its practice. I listened to some, deleted others, and replied to none, not out of cruelty, but because I knew any conversation right then would be another negotiation of my worth, another attempt at rearranging the truth until it fit her comfort. Only one voice made me hesitate, my granddaughter's, soft and unsure, leaving a message that did not ask where I was or what I was doing, only whether I was safe, whether I was happy, whether I needed anything. I wrote her number down on a scrap of paper and slipped it into the same drawer as my husband's letters. I would call her, I decided, but later, when the shape of my new life had become firm enough that no one could mistake my reaching out for a plea to be rescued. Days assembled themselves into a gentle rhythm, mornings with coffee and the slow unfolding of light over the water, afternoons spent mending curtains, oiling squeaky hinges, walking along the shore with my hands in the jacket pockets, feeling the deed folded there like a heartbeat that had steadied itself at last. Sometimes I thought of my daughter bustling through her immaculate kitchen, talking about estate planning and image and safety. Sometimes the thoughts were bitter. Sometimes they were simply distant, like remembering an old job I had once worked far too long. I did not hate her. Hatred would have tethered me to her as tightly as guilt once had. Instead, I let her recede to a manageable distance, a part of my story, but no longer its author. One evening, as the sky bruised itself into twilight and the first stars began to pierce the thin skin of dusk, I sat at the small table with a sheet of paper and my one good pen. I wrote a letter, not to my daughter and not entirely to my granddaughter either, but to whatever woman might someday find herself sitting on the edge of a bed, clutching some worn scrap of the past, being told it smells like death by someone who has never learned to recognize the scent of loyalty. I wrote that it is never too late to remove yourself from a room where your existence is treated as an inconvenience, that no amount of shared blood obligates you to live as a ghost in someone else's house, that the objects we cling to are often less important than the quiet permission they conceal, the whispered reminder that we once belonged to ourselves. I told her that leaving does not erase the years given, the meals cooked, the nights spent awake with worry. It only reclaims the years still left. I told her that there is no age at which choosing yourself becomes inappropriate. When I finished, I folded the paper and tucked it behind my husband's last note. Perhaps no one will ever read it. Perhaps years from now, some stranger will find it in a drawer and shrug. That doesn't matter. What matters is that I wrote it, that I said the words out loud in ink, if not in sound, that I affirmed to myself what I had always offered others, but rarely believed I deserved: mercy. Now, at night, when the wind presses against the windows and the house creaks like an old ship, I lie in bed with the jacket hanging on the chair and feel no dread that someone might come in and decide its fate for me. I think of the woman I was in my daughter's kitchen, watching my husband's memory fall into the trash, and I want to reach back and tell her, "Hold on. There is a house with your name on it and a life you haven't met yet. I cannot change what happened, but I can sit here under this salt-scrubbed roof with the sound of the sea for company and know that in the end I did not vanish." I walked out. And if you, wherever you are, feel the weight of someone else's version of you pressing down on your chest, remember this old woman by the water, packing one bag and following a letter in a pocket all the way to a front door that opened when she turned the key herself.